Erev Tov, everybody. Parashat Chukat is this week. We had a wonderful shiur a week ago, Shabbat, between Mincha and Maariv by Rabbi David Silber, in which he talked about the division of the book of Bamidbar into two parts, reflective of the generation that went forth from Egypt and the generation that went into the land, and actually focused on the song at the sea and the Song of the Well as the kind of characteristic watershed moments for each of those generations. Really wonderful shiur. I don't know if it's written up anywhere, but it's of the theme of the way of using Parashat Chukat in many ways to talk about the overall structure of the book of Bamidbar and these two generations and the transition between them. And Rav Samit in this essay very much takes the same approach as we've done all book. We're going to stick with the English. The Hebrew is a little more extensive and very, very deeply footnoted and worth a read on its own. But in the interest of time, we'll take the English translation and slight abridgment, which I'm going to share on my screen now and begin to make our way through. Okay. Chukat, a watershed in Sefer Bamidbar, starting with Abarbanel's approach to dividing Sefer Bamidbar. There are two basic approaches to dividing Sefer Bamidbar, each of which regards Parashat Chukat as the place of division. The first approach we shall examine is that of Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, who writes in the introduction to his commentary to Sefer Bamidbar. The 10 Sidarim of the book of Bamidbar, right? We've got 10 Parshiot, Bamidbar, Naso, Balotcha, Shlach, Korach, Chukat, Balak, Pinchas, Matot, Maseh, can be divided into two sections. The first part consists of the first 5 Sidarim, narrating all the trials and tribulations of their desert wanderings from Bamidbar through Korach. The second part, consisting of the remaining 5 Sidarim, recounts what happened to them in the wars they encountered when they reached inhabited areas, Chukat through Maseh. It would seem that the Abarbanel means that the second part of the Sefer starts at the beginning of Parashat Chukat, immediately after the command concerning the red heifer. Which, just to zoom over to our Parsha for a moment, Parashat Chukat starts with chapter 19. Remember, we ended off last week with the end of Korach and the particular gifts of the Levites and guidance around that. Now we come to Parashat Chukat, which opens with chapter 19, which deals with the laws of the red heifer and various purifications from tum'ah, from coming into contact with a corpse. That occupies chapter 19. And then we come to chapter 20, which he'll discuss. So it would seem that the Abarbanel means that the second part of the Sefer starts at the beginning of Parashat Chukat, not exactly the beginning, one chapter in, immediately after the command concerning the red heifer, at the beginning of chapter 20. And Bnei Yisrael, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Tzin in the first month, and the nation dwelled in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. The commentators, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, and others, maintain that this occurred at the beginning of the 40th year after the Exodus. And in the Hebrew, he has a really fascinating discussion of this pasuk and the fact that it refers to both Bnei Yisrael and the whole congregation, and goes a little bit more into literary analysis. We'll leave that. The commentators maintain that this occurred at the beginning of the 40th year after the Exodus. If this is so, we need to consider the Torah's long silence regarding the history of the generation that left Egypt. After the sin of the spies, Parshat Shlach, we hear almost nothing for a period of some 37 years. The sin of the spies took place in the middle of the second year after the Exodus, and immediately thereafter the punishment of desert wanderings for 40 years came into effect. What does the Torah tell us of this period? It describes only one incident, the rebellion of Korach and his followers, right? After Shlach, we have Korach. The Ramban and other commentators believe that Korach's rebellion took place immediately after the sin of the spies, while they were in Kadesh Barnea. For, and this is quoting the Ramban, then the spirit of the nation was bitter, and so at that time Korach found the opportunity to protest against Moshe's actions believing that the nation would listen to him, right? So some of the commentaries see Korach's rebellion as sort of Korach being an opportunist and taking advantage of the low morale of the people in the wake of the rebellion of Korach, and in the wake of the sin of the scouts and the punishment, and seizing on that opportunity to attack Moshe, Aaron, etc.'s leadership. In which case, it happened for the Ramban and others right after Parashat Shlach. If this is the case, then the episode of Korach too belongs to the second year after the Exodus. Following this, there's a long silence during the transition from Parashat Korach to Parashat Chukat. We reach chapter 20, verse 1, having passed over a huge black hole in the continuity of the Torah's narrative. Following this narrative gap, we are now presented with a new situation. The generation of those who left Egypt has now disappeared, and a new young generation, for the most part born in the desert and unfamiliar with the experience of slavery, now occupies center stage. In between the conclusion of the story of the generation that left Egypt in Parashat Korach and the beginning of the story of the second generation in our Parashah, we find the command regarding the red heifer, chapter 19, separating the two generations, right? We end off Korach, that's at the end of the second year, and then we have chapter 19, and then we come to chapter 20 in the beginning of the 40th year. This mitzvah would seem to belong in the laws of purity and impurity found in Sefer Vayikra, chapters 11 through 15, right, in Parashiot Shemini, Tazri, Mitzorah. Its borderline position here signifies the conclusion of the decree passed on the generation that left Egypt in the wake of the sin of the spies. In this desert, your corpses will fall, right? So it's there because it's sort of thematic of what occupies those 40 years in between, or 37 years in between Korach's rebellion and now, which is basically the death of a generation. That's sort of the significant action. And so we have this sort of law about purification from coming in contact with the dead, because that's kind of the theme or the main event of these 37 years. With the conclusion of this process of distinction between the two generations, we reach the stage of purification from the impurity of death in preparation for the new and pure life that awaits the generation about to enter the land of Canaan. So a little bit of sermonic license here, kind of the fact that we focus on purification from coming in contact with the dead in chapter 19, highlights the fact that there has been this generational death over the black hole period of these 37 years, and now we've kind of come clean from that. Of course, there's an irony here, which he'll touch on, which is that if chapter 20 is supposed to mark this new generation, but it starts with the death of Miriam, it continues on with information about the death of Moshe eventually, and ends with the death of Aharon. So that first chapter, which is supposed to be after the purification from a generation dying, has the death of two leaders and the announcement of the death of a third. He'll address that. So with the conclusion of this process, we reach the stage of purification from the impurity of death in preparation for the new and pure life that awaits the generation about to enter the land of Canaan. Hence, this division of Sefer Bamidbar has a demographic historical basis, right? It's sort of focused on these two generations, dividing it that way. In his introduction to Sefer Bamidbar, the commentator A.S. Hartum writes, this Sefer includes the story of what happened to Bnei Israel from the first day of the second month after leaving Egypt until sometime after Aharon's death on the first of the fifth month of the 40th year, and the laws given during that period. It can be divided into three parts. A, the wilderness of Sinai, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 10, verse 10, when they haven't moved. B, on the way from the wilderness of Sinai to the plains of Moab, chapter 10, verse 11 to chapter 22, verse 1. And then C, the plains of Moab, chapter 22, verse 2 to chapter 36, verse 13, the end of the book. The verse which, in the view of this commentator, serves to divide the first two parts of this Sefer from the third is the last verse of Parashat Chukat. And Bnei Yisrael traveled, and they encamped in the plains of Moab on the far side of the Jordan by Jericho, right? So just circling back to our Parsha for a minute, we have chapter 20 that we spoke about announcements of Moshe's death, ending with the death of Aharon, and then the kind of complaints, the Song of the Well, some attempts to pass through various lands, and then fighting, the end of a battle, and then Israelites marched on and encamped at Arvot Moav across the Jordan from Jericho. That's the sort of rest of our parashah, bringing it to its end when they have kind of come to their final pre-entry into Canaan destination, the plains of Moab. In the plains of Moab, Bnei Israel reached the final encampment of their journey from Egypt to the borders of Canaan. Here they camped for a few months, at the end of which they would cross the Jordan and begin the conquest of the land, as recounted in Sefer Yoshua. During their encampment in the plains of Moab, all of the events still to be narrated took place. The story of Balak and Bilam, the sin of Baal Peor and its consequences, the end of Balak and beginning of Parshat Pinchas, the national census in Pinchas, the war against Midian, Parshat Matot, and some other events. And it was here that Moshe made his great speech comprising Sefer Devarim, right? So really, the third section of the book of Bamidbar actually in certain ways encompasses all of Sefer Devarim as well, because it's the events at the plains of Moab, right? Starting on Rosh Chodesh Shvat and lasting until his death on the 7th of Adar. Here we're depending a little bit. Here he's Rav Salmon is turning a little bit to rabbinic interpretation. Not all of these dates are explicit in the Torah. According to this division, we find that the story of Bnei Israel's wandering in the desert is recounted up until the end of Parshat Chukat. From Parshat Balak until the end of Sefer Dvarim, we find a description of the events that took place at their final encampment, at the point of their departure for the conquest of the land, in the plains of Moab on the far side of the Jordan facing Jericho. This division then is based on a geographic historical perspective, right? It's not about focusing on one generation and then the next, but focusing on the places Bnei Israel were encamped at Har Sinai for the first 10 chapters, journeying through the wilderness for those middle 10 chapters, more or less, and then encamped at the plains of Moab for the last 14 chapters or so. The events described in Parshat Chukat itself should be understood as a series of events that arise from a mismatch of these two verses, which the commentators use to divide the Sefer, and from the tension that unavoidably accompanies this mismatch. Let us explain. First, let's remind ourselves what the two verses are. Chapter 20, verse 1. Bnei Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Tzin in the first month. They dwelled in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. And chapter 22, verse 1, at the end of the Parsha, Bnei Israel traveled and they encamped in the plains of Moab on the far side of the Jordan by Jericho. Okay, so the mismatch between these two verses and the tension that unavoidably accompanies this mismatch. Let us explain. With the disappearance of the generation that left Egypt and the entry of the second generation onto center stage at the beginning of the 40th year and the beginning of Parshat Chukat, everyone expected an end to the wandering and a gathering at the border point in preparation for the conquest of the land. The divine plan was that the previous entry into the land via the mountains of the Negev, right? That's where the scouts entered. Aluva Zeba Negev, go up here through the Negev, i.e. a south-north course, which had produced such disastrous results in the previous generation and the scouts' mission, should not repeat itself. Rather, the nation was to enter the land from the east, via the plains of Moab, north of the Dead Sea. Upon reaching Kadesh, a city on the edge of the border of Edom, at the beginning of the 40th year, Moshe sends messengers to the king of Edom, asking permission to cross his land along the shortest route to the plains of Moab, which lie on the banks of the Jordan facing Jericho. The king of Edom's refusal to allow Bnei Israel to pass through his land on the highway causes the nation to steer away from him and turn from Kadesh and Hor Hahar southwards, the way they came to the Red Sea Road, in order to walk around the south and east of Edom. That way. Now they have to continue their wanderings for a few more months in the great eastern wilderness that lies to the east of the kingdoms of Edom and Moab, and they will reach the plains of Moab only during the winter months of that year. The entry into the land will begin only in Nisan, after the conclusion of the 40th year, right? Essentially the sort of start of the 41st year. This year will therefore mostly be spent wandering in arid regions, like all the years of wandering that have preceded it. The nation which saw the promised land so close to being within their reach now has distanced itself from the land, dealing once again with problems of water and other such desert considerations. This is highly reminiscent of what took place at the sin of the spies, when their fathers were commanded at another Kadesh, tomorrow turn and journey into the desert on the Red Sea Road. It is not surprising, then, that at this point we are told, and the nation was discouraged because of the journey. Circle back there. Vatiktsar nefesh ha'am baderech. The people grew restive on the journey. The cries of the 40th year are therefore a result of the continued wanderings of the second generation, and from their suffering because of their wish to finally enter the promised land. Therefore, all of the actions of this generation, both positive and negative, should be compared with those of the first generation, so as to demonstrate the superiority of the new generation. Even when they sin, they appear quite different from their fathers. They long not for Egypt, but for Canaan. This generation despises desert life because they wish to live a natural life in their land. They are quite prepared to fight in order to enter the land and to conquer it, and their test lies in showing restraint towards those nations surrounding them, against whom they may not wage war. This is the key to the study of Parshat Chukat, which means, of course, not chapter 19, a little bit chapter 20, and especially chapter 21. Let us now make some observations concerning the various events described in it. Okay, so just again, reviewing what we've seen up until here. We have two ways of kind of dividing up the book, and the kind of tension point is the end of the first two sections in the 3-section division, or the end of the first section in the 2-section division at the beginning of Chukat, or at the end of Chukat. And what Rav Salmon is pointing out to us is, well, the beginning of Chukat was supposed to be the end of Chukat, meaning that those 2 points were supposed to be one and the same, poised to enter the land. But getting from the brink of being poised to enter the land to actually poised to enter the land took longer than expected because they couldn't pass through the area they wanted to pass through. That led to a whole set of wandering, which mimicked the experience 37 years earlier of the Exodus generation's beginning wanderings, but and looks very similar because there's lots of complaining, even mentioning Egypt. But now what he wants to demonstrate to us is the fundamental restlessness of the people is not to go back to Egypt, as it was in the first generation, but it's to go forward to the land of Canaan, which is the goal of this second generation, and that kind of marks their progress in a very positive sense. So this is the key to the study of Parshat Chukat. Let us now make some observations concerning the various events described in it. Let me go back to sharing my screen. I sent before you Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. The first events of the 40th year described in the text, now he's going to deal with chapter 21st, are the following. The death of Miriam in Kadesh, the punishment of Moshe and Aaron at Mei Merivah, you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them, the death of Aaron at Hor Hahar, as the start of the punishment decreed at Mei Merivah. Here he's not touching on every single detail, but the main themes and areas of this chapter. It's difficult not to perceive a connection between these events. All deal with the disappearance of the leadership associated with the previous generation, the leadership of the 3 children of Amram, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. The death of 2 of them is described in our Parashah, Miriam in the 1st month of the 40th year and Aaron in the 5th month. Moshe's death is decreed in our Parashah, but it takes place only at the end of the 40th year in the 11th month, representing the last event described in the Torah. Why did these 3 personalities continue to lead the people into the 40th year while their generation has disappeared? This too reveals the dual nature of this year. It is a time of transition between those events associated with the exodus from Egypt and wandering in the desert, and those associated with the conquest of the land and its inheritance. From the demographic perspective, that was the Abarbanel's division. This year belongs to the generation of the conquerors and inheritors of Eretz Canaan. But from a geographical perspective, that was the Khartoum analysis, the year still holds more wandering in the vast and terrible wilderness. And the wanderers, like their fathers, still need miraculous leadership in order to ensure their continued survival there. The 40th year may therefore be described as one of transition, with a gradual process of a wandering nation becoming a warfaring, conquering, and settling one. Although at the beginning of the year it becomes clear that the wanderings are not yet over and that Bnei Israel will have to circumvent Edom and Moab, journeying again through barren wilderness for another half a year. When they reach the plains of Moab in the second half of the year, it becomes clear to them that they are already engaged in a war of conquest. And even in the first stages of settlement of those areas which they have conquered, Rabbi Sober in his shir a couple weeks ago also talked about this idea that kind of the transition really happens here as the people kind of shift from wandering. Even the conquest of the lands on the east side of the Jordan are a form of the conquest of the land of Canaan. It even discusses the fact that the lands that they are conquering are lands that were sort of originally Canaanite lands. And so this really is the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. Since the 40th year represents a gradual transition from the miraculous existence that characterized the desert period to a natural existence worthy of a nation entering its land, we see a corresponding gradual disappearance of the previous leadership. At the beginning of the year, Miriam dies, in the middle, Aharon, and at the end of the year, we read of the death of the leader who brought his nation to the border of the land and witnessed the initial wars and victories, but was not permitted to see the full realization of the vision. The great merit of these leaders ensured that they did not die prior to the 40th year, and also that they were not included amongst those included in the decree of death following the sin of the spies who despised the land. The merit of Israel ensured that their previous leaders did not disappear before the circumstances were right for the great change that was to take place in their lives. So that's his analysis of chapter 20 onwards. The final two complaints in the desert. Parashat Chukat describes the last two complaints of Bnei Israel in the desert, concluding the list of complaints that began just after the Exodus. The first complaint in our parashah is the one that was raised in Kadesh following Miriam's death, because, quote, there was no water for the congregation. This event is reminiscent of what took place at the beginning of the nation's journey, when they reached Refidim and thirsted for water, as described in Parashat Bashalach. Even the place names are similar, Masa and Meriva in Sefer Shmot, corresponding to Me Meriva in our parashah, and there are also several linguistic parallels between the two complaints. The second complaint of our parashah occurs during the journey from Hor Hahar around Edom. The spirit of the nation was discouraged because of the journey, and the nation spoke against God and Moshe. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? For there is no bread and water, and our soul loathes this miserable bread. This complaint, I see your hand, Brech, I'll go a little further, but I will come back to you. This complaint, too, echoes a previous one related to despising the man, the complaint of those who desired meat described in Parshat Bahalotcha, the last time we learned together, actually. Who will feed us meat? We remember the fish which we ate in Egypt for free. Now our soul is dried up. There is nothing except for this manna before our eyes. And you may recall that in his essay on Bahalotcha, Rav Samet also compared this complaint about man to their complaint, just after the Exodus from Egypt, and sort of pointed out that, the people complaining immediately after the Exodus was a little bit more justified. They didn't have much sustenance yet. They were just beginning their relationship with God. But this one in Parashat Baalotcha already, some number of months later, they, arguably ought to have, had more faith in God developed by this point. So this one is sort of a low, both compared to the complaint that preceded it, and we're going to sort of see that Rav Samet will compare this one, unfavorably relative to the complaints of this generation in our parashah, the ones that are awaiting going into the land. It would seem that nothing has changed in the course of all these years. And the complaint that was repeated so many times by the previous generation, why did you bring us out of Egypt, appears twice more in the words of the younger generation. Has nothing at all changed, right? We have, why did you bring us out of Egypt to die in the desert? We have, I hope quoted the second one as well in a little while. Let us begin by examining the second complaint in our parsha. Although it is true that the nation despises the man, like their forefathers who craved meat, and although they repeat the same old line, why did you bring us out of Egypt to die in the desert? And this is again considered sinful, and they are punished with the snakes. Again, in the interest of time, we're not delving into these in their context, but we'll see them when we hear the parsha. Nevertheless, there is an enormous difference between this scenario and the one described in Parshat Ba'alotcha. The first generation despised the man during the second year after the Exodus, because they longed to return to Egypt, remembering fondly the meat and fish and vegetables they ate there. The second generation despises the miserable bread that descends miraculously from heaven, because their soul is discouraged because of the journey. They believed that they were about to enter the land, and now they have to backtrack and circumvent the land of Edom, once again wandering in the desert and fed by miracles. The new generation does not long for Egypt. Indeed, they have no memories of Egypt. Most of them were never there. Rather, they are eager to enter Canaan. Their problem is not that they miss the meat and fish and vegetables of Egypt, but rather that there is no bread nor any water. They desire a natural terrestrial existence, one that is not dependent on miracles. They want water that comes down from heaven and bread that grows from the earth, not the opposite, as is the case in the desert. I think a very sharp insight here, right? In the desert, they get water that comes up from rocks and things like that, and bread that rains down from heaven. That's all miracles from God. And they're saying, enough, we're ready to go into the land and to, work it and get our rain and water and bread in the natural way. Again, this is a kind of using his broad thesis. He's applying that to this language because on the face of it, as he said, it does seem really similar what we're seeing here in chapter 21 to what we saw in Ba'alotcha. Similar, why did you bring us out of Egypt? Similar, loathing the bread. So he's focused on discouraged because of the journey, given the context that this journey shouldn't have had to happen. They should have been able to go into the land again. And the overall analysis that he's making, interpreting it in that light. The differences are small, but he's magnifying them based on his thesis. Okay. The new generation, we did that. Great. Their words are indeed sinful, but they reveal the progress that has been made since the previous generation. Their sin arises from their longing to live in the promised land. We may also say in their defense that the frustration of once again having to distance themselves from the land and return to the wilderness causes their soul to be discouraged, and so they speak as they do. Let us now turn our attention to the nation's complaint and Mei Merivah. This is back in chapter 20. The corresponding complaint at Massa and Merivah of the nation that had left Egypt, right, in Shemot, was clear and simple. Why then have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our flocks with thirst? There is a clear expression here, one of many during the time of that generation, of the fact that when faced with any difficulty, there is an immediate display of their wish to be enslaved with hard labor to those who hate them, rather than being the nation of God like a son who serves his father, quoting the Ramban. But a close examination of the language used by the next generation at Mei Merivah reveals that the crux of their complaint is not about coming out of Egypt, but rather about their continued stay in this desert, right? And why did you bring God's congregation to this desert to die there, we and our flocks? Why did you bring us out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Not a place of seed or figs or grapes or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. This desert, this evil place, these are presented not in contrast with Egypt, as would have been the case in the previous generation, but rather in contrast with the land of Canaan, the land described by Moshe, albeit later, in terms that contrast completely with their complaint about the desert. How does Moshe describe the land that they're going to go into in Devarim chapter 8? A good land, a land with streams of water, of fountains and deep springs that burst forth from valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, and grapes and figs and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and date honey. Attention should be paid to what it is that they feel they lack in the desert. Going back to our quote here from chapter 20. What do they feel they lack? Seed, figs, grapes, and pomegranates, and water. Seed, wheat and barley. Figs and grapes and pomegranates. Precisely the fruits for which Eretz Canaan is praised. We'll come back to those last two, olive oil and date honey, which are missing here in their complaint in a moment. And there is no water to drink, the exact opposite of the beginning of Moshe's description of the land, all the water, fountains, and deep springs. Why does the nation not mention the last two types of food for which the land is praised, olive oil and date honey? It would seem that the reason is because oil and honey are luxuries, which one could live without if necessary. This implies that they are not complaining over a lack of luxury, but rather over a lack of the basic essentials for survival: water, bread, and fruits. Again, in the second complaint, they declare that there is no bread, nor is there water. Let us summarize as follows. Upon reaching Kadesh at the beginning of the 40th year, with the younger generation now standing close to the border of the land ready to inherit it, and with the death of Miriam, one of the leaders of the previous generation, there is eager expectation on the part of the new generation that they will enter the land immediately. But once again, they face a familiar problem. There was no water for the congregation, as was the case at the beginning of their journey, shortly after their fathers left Egypt. This crisis, so characteristic of desert wanderings, causes great frustration. Are their desert journeys not over? Has the time for their entry into the land not yet arrived? Has the generation of those who left Egypt not already died out, the sin of the spies forgiven? They, the children, are now so close to the land. In any situation of prolonged waiting and expectation, this is his general psychological comment, the last part is harder than any time that precedes it. Here, too, the 40th year is harder for this generation to bear than all of the previous 39 years. And so they lose patience for the continued journey in the desert, and we hear them complaining over the fact that the purpose of the Exodus has not been fulfilled. They are still in this evil place, the complete opposite of the good land which they so long for. God understands them and tries to ease their psychological distress in God's great mercy. Moshe and Aaron do not understand them, since they do not belong to this generation and its experiences. They see this generation as the direct continuation of the previous one, and they therefore fail to understand God's mercy towards them and God's support for these rebels. Becomes apparent, therefore, that Moshe and Aaron are no longer able to continue leading this generation. Okay, I think a really nice analysis, again, gives us the consistent with the theme of recognizing Parashat Chukat as the transition, thinking about whether it's the transition happens at the beginning or at the end, and sort of arguing that it's the beginning was supposed to be the end, and this whole middle, which came from the fact that they couldn't go straight towards the land, is what led to all of this frustration, and thereby brings this charitable reading of their frustrations. Still not right. Still should have had more patience, but it's a frustration of anticipation of where they want to get to, as opposed to a frustration about wanting to go back to where they came from. And this also sort of deals with, some of the continuation and then end of the leadership of the wilderness generation in chapter 20, and helps us sort of see this transition playing out in phases and literarily in these couple of chapters. Bracha, go ahead, please.
Yeah, going to the pasuk about there not being water, it is very similar to the previous iteration in that it doesn't really specify that there wasn't water to be found. It says v'lo haya mayim la'edah, that there wasn't water for the congregation, and that it says for the congregation rather that it's that the lamed is actually more saying to the congregation than for the congregation. So that also emphasizes that it may be more of an attitude problem.
Interesting.
Similar to the last time when it was in slightly different words but conveying the same idea.
Yeah.
It said that they couldn't find water, but it doesn't mean
Right.
it wasn't
Right.
available.
Right. Lo matzu mayim, and here lo haya mayim la'ida. There was somehow a mismatch as opposed to a complete absence. Interesting reading. Yeah, great. Thank you. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, I thought what Bracha said was absolutely fascinating and on target. My problem here is...
Whoops, sorry, accidentally got muted. Go ahead, unmute yourself, Lance. Sorry about that.
Sorry. What Bracha said, I totally agree with. I thought it was fascinating, excellent insight. And it leads me to describe the dualism that you're talking about, the evil place and the good place. And I would substitute the words Bamidbar and Hamakom. And what you're really saying is there is a perception here. I think that what Bracha was trying to get at. There is a perception here of two different worlds. Now, one of the things that fascinates me is this rabbis and scholars are trying to make the distinction between the natural world and the miraculous world. The problem I have is if you go into the book of Jericho, it's a miraculous world, right?
Mm-hmm.
The miracles there. It's not the miracles disappeared, and no, they're playing miracles there. And it seems to me that my favorite example would be the FedEx logo. How many are you familiar with the FedEx logo?
Yeah.
The arrow in the
Yes.
FedEx logo. It's not there. It doesn't exist materially. It's only in human perception.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that arrow. And it seems to me that there is a difference in perception between the place of Hamakom, which is the holy place, and the place of Bamidbar, which is the secular or profane place. And what I would suggest is that the sacred and the profane are in one place simultaneously.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Is that a particular place or is that every place?
For me, it's every place.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, reactions to this piece? All right. The hour is late. So oh
I
yeah, please,
like,
Debbie. Great to hear your voice.
thank you. I liked when you brought out that Bnei Israel, once again, the second generation was so close, and that it was like teasing them. And that's what brought out their frustration. I'd never really thought about that. And that was a very interesting angle. And that was the tipping point. That's why they started to complain again, that they were there. And then when Edom said no, and then they had to do a whole, detour. And that's what set them off.
Yeah.
It was like they could smell it. And then again, I thought that was great. That was very good reading.
Yeah, that's a nice insight of Rav Samitz, and again, he didn't let them off the hook. He still said, "Listen, they could have done better, but there's a context to understand their frustration that was driving this, which was a different kind of frustration." I think it's like it's an interesting kind of teaching in general that there, when you're when you're in relationship with someone and they're acting frustrated, right? You ask her, well, what are they frustrated about? And if their frustration comes from, wanting to achieve more and feeling disappointed, there's something to appreciate about what the driving motivation is. There's still guidance and support to give about how to best manage and express that frustration. But, there's frustration coming from a noble goal, as opposed to otherwise. And again, there are charitable understandings of the nation that exited Egypt also. They were, they just got out of slavery. So how much could we have expected of them either? Again, I think the biggest critique was what we saw a few weeks ago in Bahalotra, was the sort of sense post-Sinai, as they were emerging into the wilderness journey, which was supposed to be short. That's where we were hoping for more from them. But even there too, we understand, that they were just at the beginning. So I think there's a lot here about how we read people's motivations that impacts how we react to their behavior. Yeah. All right. Onwards. Looking forward to hopefully not being interrupted schedule-wise as we go through the last few weeks of Bamidbar with Rav Elchanan Samet. So thanks to all. Great to learn together. Love to mom and dad, and good night to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.